The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local journalism today at chly.ca/donate. Local news doesn't survive without local support.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. The BC Federation of Students says the province's post-secondary system is in crisis. The organization says that there have been almost 1,000 layoffs in the sector since 2023, with 80 programs suspended, paused, or cut. They're calling on the BC government to increase the amount of funding headed to post-secondary schools in the province, and they spent last week lobbying MLAs on the issue in Victoria. I spoke with a representative from the BCFS.
Hi, my name's Cole Reinbold, and I'm the Secretary-Treasurer for the BC Federation of Students, a provincial student advocacy organization.
And what is the message that you have been recently trying to pass to the provincial government?
Yeah, so it's threefold. What we've been telling to the provincial government, especially over our last week with our lobby days, is that BC's public post-secondary system is in crisis, and this has been caused by decades of systemic underfunding by the provincial government, and that the provincial government has to restore public funding in order to stabilize the sector. Right now, we are seeing hundreds, almost thousands of job losses, so many programs being cut, so all students are coming together to call for the urgent reinvestment to protect education, jobs, and BC's future.
And you're arguing that the cuts are a direct result of the federal government's cap on international study permits, but are also ultimately the responsibility of the province. Can you explain how that works?
Yeah. So I think the best way to describe it is, while the cut on international student study permits may have brought forward the issue quicker to the public sphere, it ultimately does come down to not enough funding from the provincial government over the last few decades. If the post-secondary system was funded at an adequate level, meaning 75% of operating budgets from the provincial government, then if the reduction of international study permits happened from the federal government, if the system is funded properly, that shouldn't make a difference. We shouldn't be relying on international student tuition so much that when international student study permits are reduced, that our entire system collapses.
Now, you've argued that in 2000, public funding made up a much higher percentage of institutional revenue. You said 68% versus today 40%. But in total dollars, according to StatsCan, the province is spending more money than ever before on universities, and the change in percentage seems to come down to the fact that universities just have more revenue and more revenue sources than 25 years ago. How would you kind of make sense of that?
Yeah. So I would say, even though the number is larger, that the proportion of public funding is not where it needs to be. And this can be accounted to inflation and the systemic underfunding of post-secondary education. So while the number is larger, so is the cost of rent, tuition, everything is more expensive. And at the end of the day, the government does need to return that 75% of public funding to institutional operating budgets in order to stop the crisis that we're seeing in post-secondary education right now.
You have linked to a website that's a cut tracker. It lists 3 categories. In 2 of those categories, services impacted and program cuts, more than a third of the numbers in each of those categories are made up from losses to Vancouver Island University in Nanaimo. How would you evaluate that one school's place in all of this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Vancouver Island University, my alma mater, seems to be the epicenter, the starting point of all of these cuts. And this can actually be attributed to the funding model that we're seeing that is completely out of date in BC's public post-secondary institutions. For those of you that don't know, Vancouver Island University is a special purpose teaching institution, which is broadly understood in the sector as a university running on a college budget. And so it's because the funding that is provided from the provincial government, this funding model is extremely outdated and doesn't account for the fact that institutions in more rural areas or certain programs are simply just more expensive to run. And so the reason that we're seeing these special purpose teaching institutions having these massive guttings of their budget is because the government needs to release a new funding model and increase funding to 75% of institutional operating budgets.
So some of the changes at VIU have been reported on for a while now. It's kind of been an ongoing process for the last couple of years. What have we seen recently in terms of cuts or impacts province-wide?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So recently there's been 80 staff laid off at Simon Fraser University. At Selkirk College, they've closed one of their Nelson campuses. At Coast Mountain College, they closed their Hazelton campus. So it's now no longer programs being cut, services being gutted. We're now seeing entire campuses closing, and we're seeing hundreds and hundreds of people being laid off across the province because this problem is escalating due to the funding crisis in post-secondary education. While yes, there is more funding than ever from the provincial government, this funding has not been enough to keep up with inflation and enough to keep up with increasing operating costs of training the future nurses, teachers, educators that we need in BC.
How would you evaluate the possibility that students are going to be asked to help make up the shortfall in some way, shape, or form?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would see this as something where the provincial government needs to step in, and the provincial government needs to strengthen and protect the tuition limit policy to stop institutions from downloading costs onto students. And they do this through tuition and ancillary fees. So tuition fees can go for international students any amount at any time, domestic students at 2% a year. And this cap is one of BC's most successful affordability protection measures. But institutions right now, they're using loopholes like creating brand new fees or like a student support fee, or simply renaming programs and doubling their tuition, like we're seeing proposed at Okanagan College right now. So in order to stop this from happening, the government needs to step in and create a stronger tuition limit policy and uphold the tuition limit policy that it currently has.
Has something changed about the way universities operate in the last 25 years such that maybe they're spending money on new and unique things, or if we're talking today about the model of where the funds come in, has the way funds are spent evolved?
I think what really has evolved in the past couple decades is the expanding mandates given to post-secondary institutions by the provincial government. So institutions are expected to do more and more every single year with less and less money. And these institutions, they train our future workers. They sustain our rural communities, but they can only do this if they have the public funding that they need. So it's time for the government to step up and reinvest in post-secondary education.
When you say the universities have been called on to do more and more, can you explain what you mean? Maybe provide some examples?
Yeah. So institutions every year are given a mandate letter by the provincial government as saying what they have to do in the following term. And each year there's scope creep for these institutions. And so they're asked to do more with less and less money. And by less money, I mean the percentage of operating budget that is given by the provincial government. The scope creep that we're seeing is what is causing a big part of the crisis that we see in post-secondary education. The government is expecting institutions to do more with less money.
Now, we're in a time of economic uncertainty. There's a lot of talk about the potential impact of tariffs, the trade war with the United States. In this context, how receptive do you think the provincial government is going to be to the idea of spending more money on the university system?
Yeah, so I think the lens that we need to take here is that cuts don't just affect students. The post-secondary crisis affects all of BC, every single person, because BC relies on a strong, skilled, and local workforce. And without urgent intervention by the provincial government, BC is going to face worse long-term damage to healthcare, education, and trades training, because post-secondary education is the foundation of BC's success.
You have been speaking, the BCFS has been speaking with representatives from the provincial government over the past week or so. Can you give me a sense of how those conversations went and maybe how receptive the government was to what you were saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we had our provincial lobby week in Victoria, where we talked to over 40 MLAs about the issues in post-secondary and equipping them with what they need in order to fix the crisis. And I would say that this week it was quite positive. We had excellent conversations across party lines about our recommendations to fix post-secondary education. And I'd say that the future is bright, even though we are in a deficit budget provincially. I definitely think that we've moved the needle on post-secondary education, because post-secondary education has become a kitchen table issue in the past year, with all the layoffs, cuts, the crises that we've seen across the province. It's now an issue that is in the forefront of MLA's minds. So, this lobby week, it was definitely hopeful. Even if there may not be money, in the immediate future, it was acknowledged that money does need to be added.
When you talk about your recommendations for the situation, beyond spending more money in the university system, what are those recommendations?
Yeah. So of our 4 lobby recommendations, only one of them is monetary, which I've already talked about, which is returning to at least 75% of public funding of institutional operating budgets. The next 3 are policy changes that is going to strengthen affordability and make post-secondary a more stable system. So the first one is funding. The second policy ask is the stronger tuition limit policy, and strengthening it so that institutions can't download costs onto students through tuition and ancillary fees. The next one is to release the new post-secondary funding model. So this is to keep education equitable, no matter where you live or what you study. You should be able to pursue that. If you want to be a nurse in Prince George, or if you want to be a nurse in Nanaimo, you should be able to study those things in those places, equitably as to somebody in the Lower Mainland. And then our last policy recommendation is the creation of a new international student strategy that implements tuition increase protections and helps with their integration into British Columbia. And so this is to help prepare BC as a world-class post-secondary education destination.
Is there anything else you think it's important to bring to the conversation on this today?
Yeah, I think it's really important to emphasize that research has shown that the only way to stabilize BC's post-secondary system, the only way to stop the cycle of cuts, is to return to funding to 75% of operating budgets annually. Because BC's colleges, universities, and institutes are laying off staff, delaying graduations. This is a full-blown crisis where we're not producing the amount of workers that we need into BC's economy because of the lack of funding. And I can't stress enough that students aren't able to graduate because there isn't enough course offerings. So they're not able to graduate in 4 years. They're not graduating in 5 years. And delaying a graduation is delaying a worker into the workforce. And we simply cannot wait any longer. The government cannot wait any longer to fund education, I'd say.
Could you tell me more about this idea of delayed graduation that you just touched on there, and describe maybe how it plays out? Yeah.
So, I can give you 2 examples. So, at Douglas College, they have higher enrollment this year than they did last year, yet they have less course offerings, so less course sections. So what that leads to is wait lists for required courses. And so the cuts are really starting to creep in at Douglas College, and our members are reporting that there are wait lists for first year required courses. And then at Vancouver Island University, this has happened for quite a few years now, where there's the slow erosion of required courses as well as electives. So I know I've met people across faculties at VIU that have had to delay their graduation to 5.5, sometimes even 6 years, because their course is only offered every other year, and they didn't get the chance to take it because there was a wait list. And then you also see this impact in electives, where students are having to take electives that are not related to their degree, simply to be able to get the amount of credits that they need to graduate. And then we're not producing the workers that with well enough skills to work in that field. So yeah, when we're delaying people's graduations, then that's another year of rent, tuition. That's another year relying on the government for student loans. Like, this is a huge issue, this slow erosion of course sections, and this slow, this slow increase of waitlist that we're seeing on post-secondary campuses is causing students to not be able to graduate in time to join the workforce.
Cole Reinbold, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me on this.
Yeah, thanks for having me anytime.
Cole Reinbold is Secretary-Treasurer for the British Columbia Federation of Students.
Midcoast Morning is part of our nonprofit newsroom project, supported by listeners like you. Keep this program on the air by funding it today with a monthly sustaining donation at chly.ca/donate. We've got tote bags and shirts if you need an incentive.
An organization representing students in BC is calling on the government to increase funding to the post-secondary system, which it says is in crisis. The BC Federation of Students says there have been close to 1,000 layoffs in the sector since 2023. The Confederation of University Faculty Associations of BC represents a number of faculty associations at research universities across the province. Their executive director also used the word crisis to describe the situation in the post-secondary system when I spoke with her on Tuesday.
My name's Annabree Fairweather, and I'm the Executive Director of the Confederation of University Faculty Associations, or CUFA BC, and we're an organization that works with the faculty unions at BC's research universities.
Now, a cut tracker created by the BC Federation of Students suggests that province-wide there have been 918 layoffs at post-secondary institutions in BC as a result of kind of general recent financial challenges. Can you give me maybe a broader sense of how faculty are being impacted by financial challenges faced by post-secondary schools in BC?
Absolutely. And the BC Federation of Students has done an excellent job of trying to raise awareness to the issues and also address the issues from students' perspective, but it dovetails very well with what faculty are experiencing at universities. Our group works with the research universities, which might have their own different experiences from the broader post-secondary ones. I can speak to some of those broader issues too. But we are certainly seeing layoffs. We are seeing program closures. We're seeing what is a deterioration of our institutions and that stability that we need as a province to have students who become workers in the province, but also become the kind of people in the province who are informing policy and doing research and those things. And we're seeing what is now a generational gap being introduced in those skills by program closures and cuts. They're stopping students from accessing school. They're stopping students from being able to access the programs in their home communities, where if programs close in one area, they might have to relocate and leave their home communities, and it's having huge effects across our whole system.
Are these challenges primarily caused by changes to the number of international study permits that schools are allowed to grant?
I would say that that is the nail in the coffin, or the last one of what's happened in a series of many decisions over many years to defund institutions, public universities we're talking about here. So what we've seen is over the course of time, governments have reduced their funding allocations to support the operating grants of universities, which really supports those core services for universities, the programs, the faculty, the wraparound services for students. We're seeing an overall decline in that investment from government, and we have for years. The provincial government and the federal governments were fine and even supportive of relying on international student tuition dollars, which are disproportionately higher from domestic student tuition dollars, or what those fees are for those programs. And they've encouraged institutions to rely on other private sources of revenue. And that is now something that the federal government has turned the taps off, and it has left our institutions with no opportunity for making up other revenue sources outside of dwindling government grants. Caps on student tuitions, which for domestic students, which we still support and have encouraged the government to maintain. And now with the reduction of international students, and the way that the federal government went about those changes has really been the last step in a long series of steps of government decisions that is sabotaging public post-secondary education. In BC, in particular, it's hitting us. But also, this isn't unique to BC. We're seeing this across Canada.
Can you give me a sense of how the provincial funding portion to universities works and how it has evolved over time?
Absolutely. And this is an area that we've spent quite a bit of time studying because also our provincial government had wanted to do a funding model review that looked at these. And so we made our own shadow review of the funding model in BC's post-secondary. And what we've seen is that over a 15-year span, government funding used to primarily be the revenue source, the largest proportion of revenue for an institution, and what was a base grant, operating grant. And we saw that government grants used to account for over 50% since about 2006 of the revenue that institutions could use. BC's, again, these are universities primarily. Today, that operating grant revenue has fallen to 40%. How it's changed over time is that we are increasingly seeing private sources of revenue be the main revenue source for institutions, and private revenue is from tuition is up well over 30% now, and quickly approaching what is the equivalent of how much government funding is in what is a public education system that is now increasingly privatized.
What do you see as the solution or the way out to some of these issues? Are there things beyond just increasing the amount of funding from the provincial government?
I think in some ways we have to address the elephant in the room, that the funding has been insufficient for many years, and we've been at a cumulative point of underfunding, that there's a crisis and there might be institutions who cannot make it through this crisis today. And that would be devastating for our system. There are, though, some considerations we're seeing even out of the BC government did their annual consultation on the provincial budget for 2026. And in that consultation process, one of the recommendations that the Select Standing Committee for Finance and Government Services made was to pick back up the pieces of a funding model review and to conclude that funding model review. We're at the point where that funding model review was introduced about 3 or 4 years ago, and it was never completed. And we think that we are too far into a system now of crisis to take more time for doing that review. We actually think there's a crisis today that we acknowledge and we recognize. And part of the answer is for the government to step up and do its part to fund post-secondary. Also in this moment, that the government's relying on post-secondary education to be the biggest contributor to supporting the workforce that's desperately needed in all, not just public sector, but in all these areas, and that they rely the skills. What is it? The Future Ready Skills Plan the government had anticipates about 1 million jobs to open over the next 10 years. And of that, 80% was going to require post-secondary education. And at the same time, they're not supporting post-secondary education. That's been a receding horizon of support. And it means that government is making choices there of its future workforce based on the funding to support university education. in terms of where we could go, I think there's also some support for looking at institutions and how they spend their money internally, to do an audit, essentially, of how the funding is being spent within the universities. And it would be in the government's interest to look at how external consultants are used for PR firms, for hiring consultants, for all kinds of there are corporate companies that are associated with exploring universities like Nous and Deloitte and Boyden, and these companies are very costly. I think that we need to look at how the universities are spending their money to make sure that it's in the interests of their academic mission to support students and to support faculty who have to make sure that those programs are viable for students. So those are two parts of it. There's also I think choices that the government can make about how much of its provincial budget it's going to allocate to post-secondary institution and commit to a stable, predictable funding at institutions that they then can make stable, predictable decisions about supporting the academic programs. We are seeing a shift in enrollments right now, that international students are decreasing in enrollments across Canada, but also especially in our province here. And we're seeing an increase, a bump in the domestic enrollments for students who are from British Columbia, from across Canada, attending in Canadian institutions. And one of the things that because of that differential in tuition amounts from those demographics, we're seeing what is more domestic students enrolled in universities, but they are not funded positions by government. And that is another area that the government only funds, basically how much they assign for enrollments, their allocations of enrollments that are assigned to the universities. And when they make those, when they sufficiently have the enrollments for domestic students, the government funds them at a per student full-time equivalency rate. But when they go over those enrollments, then those students that join the universities are not funded. And so we are seeing that perhaps the government has more avenue to fund the positions that are filled and not just the allocations. And that would actually go a long way to supporting the operating revenue for institutions, because programs are really costly to run, to make sure you have the highest technology, the best supports in the classroom for student learning, so that they're trained on up-to-date and current technology. So that was another area of funding that I think would solve it without being just more money thrown in the pot, but to actually fund the enrollments that exist.
Annabree Fairweather is Executive Director of the Confederation of University Faculty Associations of British Columbia. Midcoast Morning reached out to the Office of Minister of Post-Secondary Education and Future Skills, Jessie Sunner. We were unable to arrange an interview ahead of today's program. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
This program gives thanks to the Snuneymuxw First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.